Well, if I wasn't intimidated before, I certainly am now. That is an incredibly hard act to follow. And look, thanks so much to all of you for turning out tonight. It's my first time in Sweden and I'm a bit overwhelmed at how nice and encouraging everybody is. And I'm also a bit struck by the bad light and not bringing my glasses. But we will do our very best. And I think tonight's meeting takes place at a very important juncture in our histories. And of course, I have to start off by warning you that I come with a health warning. So anything I say, you have to note that I am on a Ukrainian list as being a Russian propagandist. Now, the reason for that was because of two things that I said. One was that sanctions hurt the ordinary people of Europe. And the second was to say that the war in Ukraine is a NATO proxy war. Now, I stand over both of those statements, absolutely. We hear all the time about Russia's unprovoked war of aggression in Ukraine, which got to get you to kind of believe, well, actually, do you know what? Maybe it was provoked. They have to say it so often. That doesn't mean it was justified. It's never justified to invade a sovereign country, but it was provoked by the actions of NATO getting nearer and nearer to Russia's borders, despite the warning of every Russian president since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Doesn't justify it, but it helps to explain it. And of course, that is now a very minority position in the European Union, but because it's a position I hold and one that many people across Europe hold, we've come to some notoriety because of it. And the only reason that I mention that is that I get contacted, and Mick Wallace, my colleague, by people all over Europe every day of the week. And the top countries of people who contact us are generally Italians and Germans, but after that, it has been Swedish people who have contacted us more than any other to express agreement with the points that we have made. So I think certainly in the hearts and minds of the Swedish people, the cry for peace and non-NATO membership is very, very clear as far as I'm concerned. Now, when Mertz asked me to do this event, it was before the 7th of October and before Israel's grotesque and sickening revenge for them. Something which is unfolding now in unimaginable horror, even as we gather here tonight so many miles away. And you might think, well, why bring that up? That's not a NATO conflict, but it would be very wrong and weird at an anti-war and anti-militarist meetings if we didn't mention something which is obviously the staggering scale of the violence being inflicted on the people of Gaza. The devastating injustice of the Palestinian situation is something that obviously is to the forefront of all of our minds at the moment. But that's not the only reason for mentioning it. We have to mention it too, because Israel would not be what Israel is, and Israel would not do what Israel does if the Americans didn't back them every step of the way. And nothing that Israel does is without the agreement and the support of the US. They are as one, and that includes on the matter of genocide right now unfolding in Gaza. The US can't wash its hands of that, and we shouldn't let it try. But neither can Europe, given the outrageous behaviour of the European Commission President over the past fortnight, erecting the Israeli flag, going to Israel, standing by Netanyahu and saying we stand with Israel, having a solemn moment for the innocent Israeli victims, very appropriate, but excluding the innocent Palestinian victims who are growing in their numbers even as we speak. And the abject failure yesterday of the European Council, who couldn't even bring themselves to call for a ceasefire. We'll have a humanitarian break. Sure, we'll give out a little bit of water, maybe a few little packages, and then the killing can go on. Get back to work, lads. This is a decision which will live in infamy forever. Most of the West now is apparently fully behind the unfolding genocide. But I think the full ugliness of Western imperialism is now on display. The mask is off And I'm not sure they can ever get it back on again. And if they try, we will certainly not let them away with it, because what is going on now is profoundly shocking, probably beyond anything we have ever seen. And while NATO isn't directly involved in the carpet bombing and terror in Gaza, it's very clear that in the same way that Israel is a proxy for the US, so too is NATO. The reality is that NATO is the extension of the United States Army, and NATO's members are essentially brigades in that army. That's the reality. There's no parity of esteem, there's no equivalence of power in NATO. America calls the shots and everyone else falls into line. NATO is actually the US Foreign Legion, start and finish. And they can talk all they like about consensus decision-making and unanimity and all of that good stuff all they like. But the reality of overweening US military and economic power means that it has no allies, only subjects. And we know, of course, that with the Lisbon Treaty and developments in Europe over the past decades, that the European Union, supposed to be a project for peace, has been moving closer in the areas of a military alliance. There had been much talk over the years about the development of a European army. Of course, the Brits stood in the way of that when they were around, not because they loved peace or anything like that, but because they loved NATO and they didn't want a competitor to NATO being on the scene. Post-Brexit and post-Trump, all of these ideas sort of came centre stage. Suddenly you couldn't move but for talk of strategic autonomy, for talk of the need for Europe to be able to look after itself militarily without the Americans, for it to kind of man up and sort of learn to exercise hard power for a change. The consistent clamour for heavy EU investment in militarism, all that had been well underway. But since the Russian invasion in Ukraine, all of the talk of autonomy has disappeared. Europe and the United States are now one, united totally, and NATO is the pure expression of their unity. But while the talk of European autonomy in defence has receded, the structures that put it in place to try and achieve it, specifically the billions of euros committed to military spending, member states being bullied and railroaded into agreeing a common threats, and a generalised and totalising commitment to militarism faster in every sphere of our life, all of that now remains. Actually, it's been turbocharged since the war in Ukraine. It had gone on and it's openly now done under the guise of NATO. So say in Ireland, for example, when our Prime Minister says, oh no, we're a neutral country. We're not going to have anything to do with NATO, but we are going to integrate closer with our EU colleagues. That's actually a red herring, because now it's basically the same thing. I think the Europe's High Representative really spelt it out, Joseph Borrell, when he said, European armies are pieces of the military capability of NATO. So whatever Europe does in order to bolster its defence, that's going to help NATO. Do we align ourselves with NATO? No, we are part of NATO. Am I in alignment with myself? Of course I am. Of course. And if you just tune in to any meeting of the Security and Defence Committee of the European Parliament, you will see NATO hawks one after the other give testimony and be fully integrated in the European structures. The truth is that the war in Ukraine was a godsend for US imperialism and for its military wing in NATO. Not only did they get a chastened Europe fully back into the fold, it got a Europe that was already aggressively militarising and whose militarisation then became turbocharged. Europe would no longer triangulate uneasily between leveraging its soft power with full-throated militarism. Europe would no longer coast along and let the Americans spend all the money. Much of Europe, and by that I mean the member states and the EU, would now prioritise security and defence. And sure, look, if there's some money left, we might look at things like, investment in infrastructure, climate change, housing, social welfare and all that stuff. But really, The main thing that we have to deal with is security and defence. And you've seen that in the figures being spent. Defence spending has soared by 14% in real terms since 2022, the steepest year-on-year rise in 30 years, and the biggest amongst all regions globally in that year. Some of the biggest increases were around where we are now. Finland, an increase of 36%, Lithuania, 27%, and here in Sweden, 12%. And that's just the member states. The EU itself, as a separate entity, that big blob of institutions in the Brussels bubble, it has its own agenda. And now it's just as aggressive and pro-NATO and pro-US as anything you'll find in the more extreme politics in Eastern Europe. The advocates of strategic autonomy, they've all been silenced, and the forces that are left are really determined to make Europe entirely subservient on US interests. They are the ones who are in the ascendancy in Brussels now. And the money that they're spending is simply off the Richter scale. Now, we know, of course, that Europe's military push started particularly around 2017, when the opportunity presented itself around, I suppose, a certain nervousness which the European capitals had in relation to President Trump. And this opportunity was seized upon by the arms industry in Europe, never one to let the grass grow under their feet or anything like that. So when the European Union started a discussion on how are we going to make Europe more safe, they called together a conference of what they called the group of personalities. Now, I'm not sure where that came from, but in any case, the personalities tended to be and ended up being a majority from the military-industrial complex who sat down and weighed up this difficult task. And surprise, surprise, the outcome that they came with was, do you know what? To make Europe more safe, the best thing we have to do is spend more money on militarism. That's the only way. And the people who made that call are the ones who are benefiting from that now. And my God, the checkbooks are open. It would take me all night to talk you through the military programs that your taxes are paying for in the name of the European Union, but it is utterly shocking. So out of that group of personalities, the first thing we got was the European Defence Fund. The first time direct money being spent from a European budget on defence. It was set up at 8 billion, but now with the war in Ukraine, they're after finding another 1.5 billion behind a chair somewhere and throwing that in to the kitty. We've had emergency legislation rushed through, not to deal with climate change, not to deal with the housing crisis, but to deal with the emergency that we just don't have enough missiles for Ukraine. So now we need the ASAP law as soon as possible, the Act in support of ammunition production. 500 million thrown into that. We have, Orwell really would be now lying awake at night thinking about these lads with some of the names that they have, but they have the European Peace Facility, which actually replaced the African Peace Facility and has been used to send weapons into a conflict zone in Ukraine. Some indication of peace there. So 12 billion spent on that. I can't waste my time on giving you the others, but the last one I'll just mention is Joseph Borrell's latest one, which is the proposal for a defence fund for Ukraine. And the budget of this is going to be 20 billion over the next 4 years. Now, they've already put 72 billion into destroying Ukraine, because if they wanted to help Ukraine, they could have supported the peace deal that was on the table in the spring of 2022. But this is another 20 billion for the next 4 years, averaging at 5 billion a year to cover the purchase of ammunition, missiles and armoured vehicles. And the proposal behind this, and you might think it's a joke, it's quite shocking that everybody in Europe isn't talking about this, but the proposal is that this funding would continue indefinitely and unconditionally, even after a ceasefire, even if there was a peace deal, as a way of deterring Russia. Many of the weapons produced under these facilities are already going to Ukraine. So on the face of it, well, maybe they won't be directly supporting NATO. However, we should remember that the money will be used to beef up European arms factories, to develop new weapons, to expand weapons production capacity in Europe. It will be used to fatten the European arms industry for use by NATO forces. It will be used to embed Europe deeper into the NATO structures and to pay for NATO's warmongering. Because, as Borrell told us, Europe is NATO, and that sadly is the truth of the situation. Now, if Brexit and Trump hadn't happened, I wondered, and maybe we can look at this in the discussion, whether the EU would have had the political space to pursue this aggressive policy of militarism. I mean, it's a much easier sell, I suppose, to say, oh, well, look, we have to arm ourselves now and organise to project hard power to protect ourselves in a world where we can't rely on our neighbour. That's an easier sell than saying we need to arm ourselves so we can project hard power on NATO's behalf. But that's actually what they're doing, but they can't call it that. So, I mean, I mentioned earlier, I think that, my own country is one of the EU member states that isn't in NATO. And to be quite honest with you, it's not going to be in NATO anytime soon. Public opinion in Ireland is... You're lucky. And I'm not blaming ye now. We have a different setup. We're very lucky in Ireland that we have a constitution, which means that every treaty, European treaty change that's proposed must go before the people of Ireland. So much as our government would like, no more than your own, for us to join up, they haven't got the ability to do what the wasters here want to do and sign up over your heads without asking you. In Ireland, they can't do that much as they would like. So public opinion is really very firmly against NATO membership. Now, I think we have to be honest that there are historical reasons for this. The Republic of Ireland was a colony up until relatively recently, and a large chunk of it remains occupied by a NATO power. So the consequence of that is obviously that there is little public appetite to join a club whose existence is the violent subjugation of other people and the occupation of their land. We've had quite enough of that at home, thanks very much, rather than encouraging that elsewhere. But I think it is important to say that despite the public opposition and the powerful domestic and external forces are working to steer us into it in the very same way as the processes that are unfolding here in Sweden and in Finland. In Ireland, the approach has been softly, it's been a mission creep. So while they say, oh God, no, we're not going to join NATO, God, no, but they still join NATO's Partnership for Peace. They sign us up to PESCO. That's going to just make us, interoperable with other European armies. Nothing to worry about there. It's energy efficiency, really. It's an economic measure, so they would say. They want us to be involved in NATO research programs. We're talking about taking part in joint projects with NATO on the protection of undersea cables. But given that there was the only destruction of an undersea cable happened in a NATO heartland, I don't see how joining NATO could help us protect ourselves from that, but there you are. And of course, the Irish government has made our civilian airport in Shannon in the west of Ireland available to the US military as a sort of a forward base for US military action in the Middle East. So, in other words, we are around the outskirts of NATO, even though it is against the wishes of the people. But it's not only what we do, it's what we say and how the narrative has changed as well, because people in Ireland are actually very proud of our neutrality. It's something that has allowed us to play a role much bigger than our size on the world stage. It's given us a positive reputation around the world. And when people think about neutrality, those facts come to mind in their heads. But the forces that are opposed to neutrality and the media, and I'll be interested to hear in the discussion if it's the same here, they kind of say, well, neutrality is something kind of shameful. We're kind of free riders. We're not pulling our weight in the defence and peace and democracy in the Western world. We haven't grown up. We're kind of like these adolescents who are preoccupied with these sort of naive ideas of justice and peace. It's about time we grew up and sort of entered the real world. They're luxuries we can't afford anymore. And all this sort of nonsense, when we really, they're trying to tell us the only way you can have peace is by war and extreme violence. And it's about time we grew up and realised that. So that's the narrative behind that. And our government thought that the war in Ukraine was going to give them the means to actually finally eliminate our neutrality. So they came up with this idea of having these consultative forums on our security. But of course, they weren't a genuine consultative forum. They were a front-loaded display of military hawks, NATO hawks and EU warmongers coming to tell us that we needed to grow up and properly join the European family, that actually we were an embarrassment and a disgrace by carrying on the way we were, by continuing to be neutral and so on. But that was actually scuppered because they went too far with that. Our president spoke out and warned about NATO and the NATO creep, and that gave loads of people the confidence to sort of call out, because they were so blatant in their choice of the panel to discuss our security future. They overshot the mark and it rebounded on them. That people then suddenly, who'd been sleepwalking into this, woke up and decided that they had to do something to defend our neutrality, which was really a good thing. And I think that was very, very important that that took place. That's a process that's ongoing at the moment. Needless to say, we are intervening in that to make sure that whatever comes out of that will not water down our neutrality any further than it is already. I mean, I think the point being that we all know instinctively is that actually NATO and more militarism, it's a lie put forward by the military-industrial complex for their own profits. Violence begets violence, and the safest way to avoid being attacked is to not attack anyone else. Everyone knows that. That's what you teach your children when they go into school. Don't give that young fella a box, because if you give him a box, he'll give you a box back. And children learn that. It's, in Ireland, we are one of the safest countries in the world because we're not militarism, not in spite of it. That's the truth. And that is, this myth that we need more militarism to make us safe is an absolute lie. And that's why, for us looking on, when we see the developments in Sweden and Finland, we know that these processes are probably very much the same nonsense that you're being peddled as we are. And maybe we're lucky, because of our history, that we are a little bit more protected from that, because you know that creeping into NATO and ratcheting up the division in Europe is not going to make your country safer. It's only going to make it less safe. And I can really imagine, because of where you are geographically, how bad the rhetoric must have been in terms of the war in Ukraine, because it was absolutely horrific in Ireland, and we're on the other periphery of Europe, so God help you, it must have been absolutely desperate, where the pro-NATO voices, who were the instigators of this war, just clouded themselves in clothes of peace and defence of the people of Ukraine, even though they're the ones who kept this war going, and the slaughter of innocent Ukrainian men who are now even off the headlines. But we're going to stay with them till the end. As long as they keep using our weapons and earning the profits, we'll keep feeding them. It's an absolute obscenity. And, I know it's not easy to make these arguments. I know we're lucky in Ireland, because of NATO and our history. And I suppose that's why it holds true. Our history protects us as well in relation to the current conflict in Palestine. If you like, issues like the weaponisation of anti-Semitism, which is so powerful in many European states, it doesn't work in Ireland, because everybody knows that their support for Palestine, which is massive in Ireland, isn't because we hate Jews. Everybody knows that Israel is a Zionist project, not a Jewish one. And our history has really come to inoculate us from that. And I'm grateful for that. But I am really interested to hear the Swedish experience from that and to learn from that. Because what we all have in common is that narratives of peace and justice are enormously persuasive and popular once people get access to them. Every human alive knows that violence begets violence. We know that. People find violence abhorrent. The outpouring of sympathy and outrage that we've seen globally in response to the devastating images coming out of Gaza really are the natural response of the vast majority of people when they see human suffering. The reaction is to empathise with that. It takes massive and relentless ideological propaganda work to numb people to other people's suffering. That's the truth. And that's the role that the mainstream media and establishment politicians have played. It's to numb people's natural, instinctive, human empathy and desire to live in peace. Ordinary people want peace. They want to be secure. They want to get on with their lives. War horrifies the vast majority of human beings because war is horrifying, which is exactly why the propaganda is so unceasing and so relentless. And it's very hard work to convince people that war is a good thing. So it's little wonder that NATO dresses itself up in the language of democracy and values and defence and all these nice, sweet things as a sort of bulwark against those who want to threaten freedom and democracy and so on. So if we want to protect those things, we have to back NATO. It's an absolute lie when we know that NATO warplanes have destroyed countless human lives in acts of spectacular aggression and terror. It's a violent imperial force that has subjugated most of Europe, and it now uses European armies to maraud around the world, destructing and destroying the lives of innocent people. NATO is the bulwark of US power abroad. It's a massive money laundering operation for the global military-industrial complex. It makes the world more dangerous, more unstable. It makes our societies poorer. It siphons off 2% of our GDP to the arms industry every year. We're all facing certain destruction and a climate catastrophe. But instead of mobilising every ounce of our being in that battle, we have a fight of humanity trapped in endless war and endless conflict. What a waste of human lives, time, energy and resources. It's sickening, and it is spearheaded by NATO. But I do genuinely think that at the moment we are at a turning point because of what's happening in Gaza now. The naked barbarism of the West is so utterly shocking and frightening, and that it's taking place in full public view as the world folds its arms and looks on, really has shaken people out of this propaganda fog that they've been in about this myth of defence alliances and all of this bad stuff. And I think coming as it does so soon after the West togged out for Ukraine, proclaimed itself fighting for freedom and democracy against the forces of authoritarianism, refused to stand for diplomacy and so on, instead arguing for permanent war. Now people can smell the hypocrisy. They definitely can, because Ukraine was never about freedom. If it was, they would have backed the peace plan. Ukraine was using young Ukrainians as cannon fodder, and the West knew this. So I think what's been done there is utterly tragic. What's been done in Gaza is beyond belief, because it's been done in our names and with our complicity. But actually, it is the seed that will undo them, because people all over Europe and all over the world are taken to the streets in unity to say enough. The people in power have most definitely misused it, but they have overshot it. Because the truth is, we live in a Europe which is dominated by its affiliation to the US, but our societies are a minority in the new world that we live in now. Most of the world's population lives in countries outside our zone, and they understand very well the need to operate cooperatively. They understand very well the rule of US empire, because they've been at the brunt of it, and they are not prepared to tolerate that anymore. So the idea of Europe shackling up its wagon to a power that is in decline is utter lunacy by these people who claim to be the leaders of Europe. But I think the emperor has no clothes because, sadly, of the horror in Palestine. People can see them for what they are. It has to be the motive force for all of us to get organised, to redouble our efforts for peace, justice and an elimination of the military-industrial complex, and for a total end to NATO.